Gottes Gaben, dass sie bei unserer Zeit so wenig Menschen haben, das macht, sie bitten Gott nicht drum. Denn von Natur geht unseres Herzens Dichten mit lauter Besummung, soll seinen Weg auf etwas Gutes richten, so muss es Gott durch seinen Geist regieren und auf die Bahn der Tugend führen. Verlangst du Gott zum Freunde, so mache dir den Nächsten nicht zum Feinde, durch Falschheit, Trug und Lies. Ein Christ soll sich der Taubenart bestreben und ohne falsche Tücke leben. Mach aus dir selbst ein solches Bild, wie du den Nächsten haben willst, wie du den Nächsten, wie du den Nächsten, mach aus dir selbst ein solches Bild, wie du den Nächsten haben willst. Heuchelei ist eine Brut, die real gehängt. Wer sich in ihrer Larve steckt, der steckt des Teufels Lieberei. Wie lassen sich den Christen dergleichen auch gelüsten? Gott sei's geklagt, die Redlichkeit ist meine, manch Teufels Ungeheul sieht wie ein Engel aus, man hielt den Wolf hinein. Denn Schafspelz kehrt man raus, wie könnte es Herr sein? Verleugnen, schmähen und rächen, verdammen und vernichten, ist überall gemein. So geht es dort, so geht es hier. Der liebe Gott, der liebe Gott, behüte mich dafür. Der liebe Gott, behüte mich. Der liebe Gott, behüte mich dafür.
it's not clear whether J.S. Bach was trying to prove something or whether he just overestimated what was needed for Sunday services. Either way, the first 4 weeks he spent in his new position in Leipzig saw the presentation of 4 very large cantatas for the first, second, third, and fourth Sundays after Trinity in July 1723. The first two pieces he presented in Leipzig after his appointment, BWV 75 and 76, were each in 2 parts, one before and one after the sermon. The third was an expanded version of an older, much revised work, Ich hatte viel Bekümmernis, BWV 21, likewise divided for that purpose in 2. On the fourth Sunday after Trinity, he did something a little different, but with the same result. He performed Barmherziges Herz der ewigen Liebe, Cantata 185, a work he had composed in Weimar, and a new piece, Ein ungefärbt Gemüte, BWV 24, after the sermon, and that's our work today. Now, there's a couple of gaps in what we know. We know of one more big 2-part piece early in his tenure, one Sunday with one old cantata and one new cantata, as on the fourth Sunday after Trinity. But soon after, Bach appears to have come to his senses and presented usually a single normal-length cantata each week. Now, the gospel reading for the day, for the fourth Sunday after Trinity, relates a sermon of Jesus on the subject of judging others. Don't, he says, if you don't want to be judged yourself. Forgive so that you will be forgiven. Measure yourself by the same measure as you use for others. Remove the plank in your own eye before concerning yourself with the speck in your brother's. Now, the author of the cantata libretto of today's piece for that date is Edmund Neumeister, a Hamburg theologian, the originator probably of the new mixed text church libretto represented by the kind we're hearing here today, the kind with recitative and aria poetry borrowed from opera and cantata, mixed with scriptural text and hymn stanzas. Bach probably pulled this libretto literally off the shelf from a widely circulated published collection called Spiritual Poems with Intermingled Biblical Sprüche, those are pithy passages, and chorales. And that, Spiritual Poems with Intermingled Biblical Text and Chorales, is a really good description, when you think about it, of this libretto. There's an aria and a recitative at the start, and also as numbers 4 and 5. A biblical passage, a statement of the so-called golden rule in Matthew's words, and a chorale to conclude. Now, Neumeister's text presents, unsurprisingly, a specifically Lutheran perspective, and we can see this in a couple of themes that run all through this text. The first concerns the terms in which the commanded behavior is expressed. Not just that a person should be good and act honestly, but that their very disposition in acting that way should be genuine. Note the very first line of the cantata refers to ein ungefärbt Gemüte, an unfeigned disposition. That is, one's goodness should be real and not simulated. The second movement calls for Redlichkeit, called a gift from God. It's called precious. Redlichkeit probably is best rendered as uprightness, but was understood particularly to mean that one's outward nature, one's outward uprightness, was consistent with one's inner essence. And also uncontaminated, and that's another sense of ungefärbt, not stained or not colored. The closing chorale asks for ein reines Gewissen, a clean or a clear conscience. All through the libretto, this is contrasted. The first recit contrasts this idea of Redlichkeit and a genuine disposition. It contrasts it with deceitfulness, fraud, and cunning, and with guile and malice. And the second recitative sees slandering, reviling, and judging everywhere. And we're headed for the opening there of the recitative number 4, where this contrasting behavior is given its name, hypocrisy, Heuchelei, called the offspring of Belial, that's Satan. Now this is extremely important to Lutheran theology, because Luther and Lutherans who followed him were very concerned with the contrast of what something appears to be with what it actually is. And this comes up in many contexts. Note in number 4, something looks like an angel, but a wolf is born inside. And you will notice, and you heard the reference to the wolf in sheep's clothing, to a mask, larva. That's actually the same root as larva in the insect sense. You see the reference to the devil's livery, that is understood here as meaning the clothing, the costume associated with a noble house, and the idea that the devil would be wearing that is itself a kind of hypocrisy. The aria number 5 calls for a heart on the inside that matches words and mouth on the outside. Now, there are many Lutheran warnings about various manifestations of hypocrisy. Luther's commentary on the opening of the gospel reading for the day the gospel reading for the day opens, "Be merciful because your Father is merciful." Luther immediately issues a warning against what he called Schalksbarmherzigkeit, the mercy of knaves, knavery mercy. That is the mercy of wickedness and deceit, which he defines as being merciful in the expectation that you will get something in return for it. So as soon as this scriptural passage opens, he is warning you about the potential hypocrisy involved in it. The other theme here relates to a second very important Lutheran principle, and that is really an answer to the question, what is the product of all this good and merciful behavior that is urged on listeners? In movement 1, it makes us beautiful before God and man. In movement 2, it has the potential to make God your friend. Number 4, we're told that uprightness is precious, that it is itself of value. And in movement 5, it has behavior like this has the potential anyway, to make us like God and angels. Note, of course, as we've said in here before, what it does not do. There is no mention of grace, redemption, salvation, or help, which is often a synonym for salvation. No mention of freedom from original sin or granting of eternal life. Jesus, of course, the agent for the believer of salvation, is not mentioned in this entire cantata. There is no human behavior in Luther's view, what are referred to as works, that could result in salvation, entirely unmerited, only faith. Of course, you see just a hint of the doctrine of fundamental human sinfulness in the Recitative number 2. The heart's fashioning, it says, keeps company only with evil, and that's a reference to what Luther believes is the fundamentally sinful nature of humankind. But that's really the only mention of it that does not play a role. This is, I would say, a challenging libretto to set to music. Every poetic movement is about an abstraction. The first movement about disposition. The second about uprightness. The third, next rested about hypocrisy. And then the aria about faithfulness and truth. Disposition, uprightness, hypocrisy, faithfulness, and truth. And these are abstractions without obvious affective, emotional connotations. And of course, the affective and emotional connotations or meanings of the text are crucial to the work of an early 18th century composer, one of whose principal goals is to move the affections of the listener by appropriate music. Also, we have a middle movement, a classic biblical spruch, or dictum, also affect neutral, a very important piece of doctrine, but not directly associated with human emotion. So how does Bach make a piece out of a libretto like this? I'd say it's a combination of variety and careful connection among movements. We have 2 recitatives, one is for tenor, one is for bass. One is scored just for basso continuo, a so-called simple recitative. The other scored for strings, so-called accompanied recitative. In the first, almost every bass note is harmonized consonantly. In the second, almost every bass note is harmonized with a dissonance. This fits, of course, the contrasting topics. The first on Redlichkeit, uprightness, the second on Heuchelei, on hypocrisy. But note how closely parallel these texts are in the libretto. They begin with a very short line that identifies the abstraction that's the subject and then says, ist eine. This abstract idea is a, and goes on to explain it in a very similar way. They're of similar lengths. And they end in a similar musical way. The speech-like declamation of recitative is abandoned in favor of a much more aria-like, tuneful presentation known as arioso, including significantly word repetition. In the first recitative, this is essentially a statement of the golden rule, mach aus dir selbst, make of yourself. And the second is a plea for defense from hypocrisy. Interestingly, this is the only line in the cantata in first person singular. It's a striking moment of individual appeal that to my ear jumps out of this text as something very different from what's around it. There are two complementary arias as well. Again, one for tenor, one for alto. One with strings, one with oboes. One has a single line obligato, the other has a duet obligato. One is in a major key, one is in a minor key. One's in triple meter, one's in duple meter. Bach contrasts almost every element. There's one in which the voice sings ritornello material from the start, that's the tenor aria. One, the first alto aria, in which the voice is largely independent of the instruments much of the time. That's two very different ways of having a voice relate to instruments in an aria. The arias are structurally different. The first aria returns to its opening text, the second does not. Now, the affects of these arias, I would say, are difficult to pin down, but I think you'd also agree they're clearly different. It's not so surprising that it's hard to figure out exactly what they are, given their abstract and largely affect-neutral texts. Maybe blithe on the one hand and introspective on the other. I'm not exactly sure those are precisely affects in themselves, but I'll let you decide what you think Bach is communicating effectively. I would say it's not entirely obvious in this piece, but the two arias do contrast. These recitative aria pairs surround a setting of a biblical text, a so-called Spruch, Matthew's version of the Golden Rule. It's the first tutti, it's the first full ensemble scoring in the cantata. Often you'll get the full scoring in the first movement, but not here with the aria, solo aria opening. Now, by long musical tradition, one way to set a pithy text like this from the Bible is as a so-called motet. That is a vocal piece without independent instruments. Motets were associated with old-fashioned musical styles, and particularly with affect neutrality, and that's one reason that composers used motet style for doctrinal statements like this one. Now, many Bach cantata movements are of this type and work in this way. Here, there's a twist, though, involving the role of instruments. The usual role of instruments when you get a motet-style piece in a cantata is that the instruments typically strictly double the voices. They simply play what the voices are singing, in contrast to movements where they have their own independent material. That's not what happens in this movement. Voices so the voice is open, declaiming the text altogether, not doubled by instruments, and that's the ear's first cue that something is going to be different here. So the voices present the text, declaiming together on their own, and then they are answered by the instruments with precisely the same phrase. The voices and instruments alternate. This is a motet, but it is a double choir motet, in which the instruments take the role of a second chorus. So it begins as a double choir piece of answering each other. But Bach soon abandons that for a more usual sort of relationship. The instruments do then start to double the voices, but not exactly. The instrumental lines are typically ornamented, elaborated versions of what the voices are singing. And there's an additional independent line pretty much the whole time. That independent line migrates between violin one and trumpet. Now, this treatment so far is largely homophonic. That is, with voices and instruments moving together, so you can largely hear them declaim the text together. Sometimes it manifests itself as what sometimes gets called animated homophony. It's not strict declamation together, but that's still the basic model. Bach will then go through the text a second time, this time in old-fashioned imitation, adding one voice at a time, first voices only, and then adding quasi-doubling instruments, plus, once again, a largely independent trumpet line. A very striking movement at the center of this cantata, a motet with some interesting twists to it. There is actually nothing like it that I know in the entire Bach repertoire. Now, the presence of trumpet in this movement is worth a comment. This is not a movement, a kind of instrument you would expect in a movement like this. From a stylistic point of view, trumpet is not an instrument you would associate with an old-fashioned motet. And that's one of the things that gives this movement its characteristic sound. Now, Bach's original performing materials, the parts which survive for this piece, refer to clarino. And here in a slightly reduced size, I made a little mock-up of the original trumpet part here. And what it's got in it is indications that you are silent in the first two movements. It says aria tacit and recitative, and then there's a tutti movement with the notes to play in it, and that continues on the back in one of the worst page turns I've ever seen in a Bach part. Often Bach and his copyists will make some allowance for this. And then the indication recit and aria tacit, and then the music of the final chorale. It's headed clarino. That typically refers to a high trumpet part. Clarino is actually not an instrument, but it's a method of playing. It's one of the ranges, the highest range in which trumpeters play. And then that term gets sort of retroactively applied to parts that call for playing in that range. So when it says it's a clarino part, that's not actually calling for an instrument called a clarino. It's understood to be a trumpet part in the clarino range. But there's no missing that it says clarino, and that's almost always, that has to imply trumpet. The issue of brass instruments brings me to the one movement I haven't talked about, and that is the last movement. It's a chorale setting, of course. The voices sing a standard four-part harmonization. If you drop the instrumental roll out of this and just stitch the vocal phrases together, you get an ordinary four-part chorale. The voices sing this four-part harmonization, and they even open the movement. They sing that first phrases. That's a nice textural echo of the way they open the third movement. But after each vocal phrase, you get an instrumental statement. The instruments do not double the voices as they typically do in a four-part chorale statement. They have their own material, and they present an instrumental statement, and often that instrumental statement will continue as the voices will enter with their next statement as well. When that happens, some of the instruments double, and violin one or a brass instrument or both have an independent line. Again, a scoring that's very reminiscent of the third movement. Now, I refer to a brass instrument in that movement because the identity of the instruments here, and especially in this last movement, is a big question surrounding this piece. Now, as I just showed you, the lines from movement 3 and movement 6 are in this same part. Again, the original would have been a little bit more that size, but laid out exactly like this on one leaf of paper. And I described the content here. This part was certainly for one player. If you had more than one player participating in a piece, you made him his own part. That's simply how it works. Parts weren't passed from one person to another, and there's lots of evidence for that. But one player playing what instrument? Because the line we heard in the third movement is clearly a trumpet line of some kind. Whether that meant a slide trumpet or a regular natural trumpet isn't 100% clear. It turns out more or less that you can make it work either way. The last movement is not a trumpet part. It does not sit on the trumpet, it's not playable. And maybe you heard that the horn part, we had it played by horn here, will double the soprano chorale line and then jump away for these really entertaining repeated notes underneath every time. And the horn player has to bounce back and forth between sort of normal range doubling, normal to high range doubling the tune, and then very low in the range to provide that really interesting accompaniment. This has been a puzzle for editors and performance of the piece because this one part, apparently for one person, seems to call for two instruments. So the most recent solution to this was a kind of calculation that it is theoretically possible to play movement 3 on the horn. It lies very, very, very high when you use a horn pitch the correct way, but it is theoretically possible. There's one really problematic note that's not really available, but that sometimes happens, making this a horn part throughout. But why then would it take clarino at the very top, if that's the case? Since Bach's copyist presumably had some pretty good idea of what was planned for the piece. I think there's a simpler explanation. If you've been to some of these talks, you probably see what it is. I think this was for a player who played 2 different instruments, as the professional brass players in Leipzig certainly did, who played a trumpet of some kind in the first movement and then switched to horn for the last. This has precedent. I brought you a little mock-up of the oboe 1 part for this piece, which has, again, says aria tacit, recit tacit, and then it says tutti because the oboe 1 plays in that choral movement, and then you turn it over and it says recit tacit, and then at the top, beginning at the top, on the back here, is the music of the second aria, the one that has the 2 oboe obbligato, but it says oboe d'amore. Actually, it says oboe d'amour, a kind of very strange combination of misspelled Italian and French. but we know what they mean. And in fact, you will have seen and heard both our oboists switch from ordinaire, the usual kind of oboe, to the slightly larger oboe d'amore that sounds just a little bit lower. And then when you get to the chorale movement, the notation tells you, and the way it's pitched tells you that they must have to switch back to normal oboe. But the copyist doesn't do the courtesy of reminding them that. They just have to figure that out. So here in this very piece is a part in which somebody had to switch instruments in the middle with no warning that it had to happen. You just have to figure it out or know from experience that that's what was called for. So for this part, the one that says clarino, but is almost certainly a trumpet part in the beginning and a horn part at the end, we have of course used 2 players today. Now, I want to stress that both of our musicians who performed these parts are talented multiple instrumentalists each. But it happens that neither of them plays both these instruments. So, our payroll is 1 person larger than Bach's. Please give generously.
Menschen haben, das macht, sie bitten Gott nicht drum. Denn von Natur geht uns des Herzens Dichten mit lauter Besum. Soll seinen Weg auf etwas Gutes richten, so muss es Gott durch seinen Geist regieren und auf die Bahn der Tugend führen. Verlangst du Gott zum Freunde, so mache dir den Nächsten nicht zum Feinde durch Falschheit, Trug und List. Ein Christ soll sich der Taubenart bestreben und ohne falsche Tücke leben. Mach aus dir selbst ein solches Bild, wie du den Nächsten haben willst, wie du den Nächsten, wie du den Nächsten, mach aus dir selbst ein solches Bild, wie du den Nächsten haben willst.
ist eine Brut, die Belial gehegt. Wer sich in ihrer Larve steckt, ist des Teufels Lieberei. Die lassen sich den Christen dergleichen auch gelüsten. Gott sei's geklagt, die Redlichkeit ist teuer, man steuert ungeheuer, sieht wie ein Engel aus, man gießt den Wolf hinein, den Schaf verkehrt man raus, wie könnte es Ärger sein? Verleugnen, schwägen und richten, verdammen und vernichten, ist überall gemein. So geht es dort, so geht es hier. Der liebe Gott, behüte mich dafür. Der liebe Gott, behüte mich. Der liebe Gott, behüte mich dafür.
Tätig sein und tun.